Her own father left her to die, condemning her as a gluttonous failure. But the legendary Lakota chief who found her would turn her greatest shame into his people's greatest strength. To her family, she was a worthless burden, a stone tied around their necks. But to Crazy Horse, the warrior who saved her, her sturdy resilience was not a flaw to be mocked, but a weapon to be forged. The scent of bacon grease and pine dust clung to the rough-hewn walls of the Maverick cabin, a permanent aroma in the chaotic heart of Virginia City's mining camps. Outside, the world was a cacophony of ringing pickaxes and boisterous male laughter, but inside, the silence was a weapon. Laura felt its weight as she reached for the last slab of cornbread. Her brother's hand, calloused and swift, shot out and covered the plate. "Best save it, Laura," Jebediah sneered, his words a familiar, casual cruelty. "Wouldn't want to spoil your figure for the suitors lining up at the door." His younger brother, Silas, snorted into his coffee cup. "The only thing lining up for her is an early grave from gluttony." Shame, hot and thick as molasses, rose in Laura's throat. She withdrew her hand, her gaze falling to the worn planks of the floor. Each day was the same. Her existence was a crime for which she was constantly on trial, her body the irrefutable evidence of her guilt. She was a burden, a disgrace, a constant fleshy reminder of failed marriage prospects in a town where a woman's only value lay in being claimed. Her father, Elias Maverick, had been watching the exchange with eyes as hard and unforgiving as the granite he blasted from the earth. He saw not his daughter but a failed investment, a mouth that consumed resources without providing any return. His patience, already worn thin by a poor season in the mines, had finally crumbled to dust. "The boys speak the truth," he declared, his voice flat and devoid of passion, which made the words cut all the deeper. "You are a failure, Laura, a stone tied round this family's neck, sinking us with your appetites." The finality of his judgment sucked the air from the room. When her brothers had gone, their boots crunching on the dusty path, Laura slipped a hand beneath a loose floorboard. Her fingers closed around the smooth, cool glass of a whiskey bottle. The liquid's burn was a familiar sacrament, a fiery ablution that promised a fleeting numbness, a momentary escape from the profound, crushing certainty of her own worthlessness. The numbness brought on by the whiskey was a fragile shield, and it shattered the moment the first tremor ran through the earth. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated up from the soles of her worn boots, shaking the very bones of the cabin. Outside, the clamor of the camp changed its tune. The rhythmic ring of pickaxes ceased, replaced by a symphony of panicked shouts and the thundering of heavy boots on the hard-packed dirt. Laura struggled to her feet, the room tilting like the deck of a storm-tossed ship. Her father and brothers burst through the door, their faces masks of grim urgency. They moved with a frantic, desperate energy, grabbing canvas sacks, canteens, and the small lockbox, where Elias kept what little gold dust they'd managed to hoard. They were a whirlwind of focused self-preservation, a unit that moved with a shared, unspoken purpose from which she was utterly excluded. Laura was a ghost in her own home, an obstacle they navigated around as they stripped the cabin of anything valuable. "The south tunnel's given way," Silas yelled, shoving a fistful of dried jerky into a satchel. "They say the whole mountain's coming down." Elias Maverick stopped his frantic work and his gaze fell upon his daughter. In his eyes, she saw no fear for her safety, no flicker of paternal concern. She saw only cold, hard arithmetic. She was a liability, another body to slow them, another mouth to feed in the uncertain days ahead. He saw the slight tremble in her hands, the glassy, unfocused look in her eyes, and his decision, already made in the quiet cruelty of his heart, was cemented. He took a step toward her, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. "We're leaving," he stated, his voice as flat and dead as the rumbling earth was alive. "You are not." The words seemed to hang in the dust-filled air, more shocking than the tremors shaking the world apart. Jebediah and Silas paused, their expressions a mixture of surprise and a dark, dawning satisfaction. "Father," Laura whispered, the sound a ragged tear in the noise. "You heard me," Elias said, his voice rising with a terrible, righteous fury. "You think we can drag a drunken sow like you through this? You are a hindrance, a savage thing with no sense, only appetite." He gestured wildly at her, then at the chaos beyond the door. "We cannot afford to carry you. You are no daughter of mine. You are a punishment, and your sentence is served here." He turned his back on her, a final, absolute dismissal. Her brothers followed him out, not daring to look at her, their haste a clear sign of their complicity and relief, the heavy scrape of the lockbox being loaded onto the wagon, the creak of the wheels, the crack of a whip. Each sound was a nail being hammered into her coffin. Then, they were gone. The cabin groaned, a long final sigh as a support beam splintered overhead. Dust and pebbles rained down from the ceiling. Laura tried to run, to follow, to scream, but the whiskey had turned her legs to lead and her tongue to stone. She stumbled, falling to her knees on the floorboards that had so often been her only confidant. As the roar of the collapsing mine grew from a distant threat to an all-consuming reality, a single devastating thought rose through the alcoholic haze. This was right. This was her penance. Her father was right. She was a failure, a stone tied around their necks, and now, finally, she was sinking. Dust and silence were her new world. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a brutal intrusion of pain, a sharp, grinding agony in her leg, where a splintered beam had pinned her to the floor. The world beyond her immediate suffering was a muted gray landscape of settled grit and the metallic taste of blood on her tongue. The roar of the mountain had faded into a series of groaning whimpers as the earth settled into its new, broken shape. This, she thought with a strange, detached clarity, was the end her father had decreed. Her sentence, served. There was a grim rightness to it, a final balancing of the scales. She had consumed, and now she would be consumed by the earth. She closed her eyes, willing the darkness to take her, but it was a different kind of darkness that came first. A shadow fell across her face, eclipsing the weak light filtering through the shattered roof. Her eyes fluttered open. Shapes stood over her, tall and lean, their forms silhouetted against the hazy sky. They were not the familiar figures of miners or prospectors. These men were silent, their presence marked by the scent of wood smoke, leather, and horse. Their dark, unreadable eyes moved over her, taking in the ruin of the cabin, the heavy timber trapping her leg, and her own disheveled, broken form. This was it, then, a final, cruel twist of fate, to survive the mountain only to meet a swifter, more violent end. The man who seemed to be their leader, whose gaze was as piercing and intense as an eagle's, knelt beside her. From an omniscient vantage, one could see into the mind of Thashunke Witko, Crazy Horse. He saw not the drunken sow her father had condemned, but a puzzle, a white woman, alone, in the heart of a disaster far from the main town. She was no threat. Leaving her was an option, a simple one. But to leave a living being, even an enemy, to be eaten by wolves or to rot in the sun was a waste, and could bring bad spirits to the land. Taking her was a burden, yet she might hold knowledge of the white man's movements. His decision was not one of pity, but of cold, pragmatic calculus. He issued a short command in the fluid, guttural tones of the Lakota language. Instantly, 2 of his warriors moved to the beam. They worked with an efficient, practiced strength, their muscles straining as they heaved the massive timber aside. A scream of pure agony was torn from Laura's throat as her leg was freed, the pain so blinding it nearly sent her back into the abyss. Before she could fall, a strong hand gripped her arm, steadying her. She was lifted, her considerable weight handled with a startling lack of ceremony or strain, and placed before one of the warriors on his pony. The movement was jarring, a symphony of torment playing along her nerves, but through the haze of pain, she was aware of the warmth of the man's body behind her, the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her. The journey was a blur of swaying trees and a vast, indifferent sky. When they finally stopped, the scent of dozens of cook fires and smoked hides filled the air. She was carried into a world of conical buffalo hide homes, of children's laughter and the low murmur of women's voices. It was a community, alive and breathing in a way the frantic, greedy heart of Virginia City never was. A woman with kind eyes and intricately braided hair approached, offering a ladle of cool water. Laura drank, the simple act of mercy so profound, so alien, that tears began to stream down her dust-caked face. She was laid gently on a soft fur inside a teepee, the shadows dancing on the hide walls. The pain was immense, her shame a heavy cloak, but for the first time in a lifetime, the crushing weight of her father's judgment was pierced by a single, bewildering ray of light, an act of kindness, given freely, expecting nothing in return. The days that followed bled into one another, marked not by the harsh clang of a dinner bell, but by the shifting slant of the sun against the taut buffalo hide of her temporary home. The sharp, shooting pain in her leg had subsided into a deep, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of her deliverance. She was tended to by the women with a quiet efficiency that asked for nothing. They would bring her bowls of a savory, rich stew she did not recognize, and water skins filled with cool, clean water that tasted of the earth itself. They moved with a placid grace, their hands busy with beating needles or scraping hides, their low, murmuring conversations a river of sound whose meaning she could not grasp, but whose gentle cadence was a balm upon the raw wounds of her soul. She saw him several times before she understood who he was. He was not a man who announced his presence with loud proclamations, but the entire camp seemed to subtly realign itself around his movements. When he walked, a path cleared. When he spoke, others fell silent to listen. His eyes, dark and restless, seemed to see everything at once: the state of the horses, the tautness of a bowstring, the direction of the wind. This was Tashunke Witko, Crazy Horse. From her place near the teepee flap, Laura watched him as he stood with his lieutenants, his hands not idle but tracing maps of unseen terrain in the dust. His mind, an omniscient eye could see, was a battlefield far larger than the camp. He saw not the peaceful valley before him, but the iron rails of the northern Pacific slicing through the sacred Black Hills, a wound that would not heal. He felt the fury, hot and sharp, at the memory of a recent council where other leaders, weary of war, had spoken of accommodation, of accepting the white man's reservations as inevitable. Fools! They could not see that to give an inch was to surrender the whole world. His gaze swept the camp and fell for a moment on the white woman. She was a complication, a ghost from the very world he fought against. His pragmatic decision to save her warred with his impatience. What use was she? Another mouth to feed, another potential weakness. Yet, to have let her die felt wrong, a violation of a deeper law. His spirit was a tempest of tactical brilliance and righteous rage, a burden that isolated him even amongst his own people. One morning, an older woman with hands as gnarled as ancient roots placed a heavy stone bowl and a pestle in Laura's lap, motioning toward a pile of dried corn. The message was clear. Work. Humiliation washed over Laura. She was clumsy, her movements awkward, her injured leg forcing her into a contorted position. She expected the familiar snort of derision, the cruel jibe. None came. The women around her continued their own tasks, their lack of attention a strange and profound form of acceptance. She pounded the corn, her soft hands quickly growing raw, her shoulders burning with the unfamiliar strain. Yet, as the hours passed, a rhythm took hold. The solid percussive impact of stone on stone was a satisfying, tangible thing. She glanced up to see the old woman watching her, a flicker of something, not pity, but appraisal, in her dark eyes. The woman nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been missed, before turning away. In that simple, unadorned moment of acknowledgement, a tiny, forgotten seed of worth within Laura's heart, long buried under layers of shame, received its first drop of rain. The craving came upon her like a fever, a violent trembling that began in her hands and radiated inward, seizing her muscles until her teeth chattered. It was a hollow, gnawing thing, a serpent uncoiling in the pit of her stomach, demanding the familiar fire of whiskey to be soothed. Without it, the world was too sharp, too loud. The constant low hum of the Lakota camp, the murmur of voices speaking a language that was nothing but music and mystery to her ears, the yip of dogs, the rhythmic thump of a hide being stretched and scraped, grated on her raw nerves. Every scent, from the rich aroma of roasting meat to the pungent odor of the herbal poultice on her leg, was an overwhelming assault. A woman with a stern, impatient face thrust a heavy wooden yoke at her, the kind used to carry 2 large water skins from the creek. It was not a request. Laura, accustomed to obeying unspoken commands, fumbled to position the wood across her shoulders. The weight was staggering, pressing down on her spine, and when the woman hung the sloshing, heavy skins from its hooks, Laura's injured leg buckled. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. She staggered, sloshing precious water onto the thirsty ground. Several women nearby paused in their work, their dark eyes watching her. She saw no sympathy in their gaze, only a cold, critical assessment that was painfully familiar. She was failing. Again. She was clumsy, weak, a burden. The same verdict, delivered in a different tongue. Her father's voice echoed in the cavern of her mind. A cruel taunt, a hindrance, a savage thing with no sense, only appetite. Just as she was about to drop the entire apparatus, a shadow fell over her, silencing the women's quiet murmurs. It was Crazy Horse. He moved with a stillness that commanded attention, his presence altering the very air around him. Laura flinched, expecting a blow, a harsh word, a final dismissal. But he did not look at her. His gaze, intense and analytical, was fixed on the awkward angle of the yoke and the water staining the dust at her feet. In his mind, the situation was simple arithmetic. The woman was injured. The task was inefficient. It wasted water, risked further injury, and created discord. It was an ill-fitting solution, and he did not tolerate such things. He spoke a few low-clipped words in Lakota to the impatient woman, his tone calm but absolute. The woman's face smoothed into an expression of deference, and she took back the heavy yoke without argument. Crazy Horse then turned to Laura. He did not offer a hand or a word of comfort. He simply picked up a single smaller water skin, one not much larger than a canteen, and held it out to her. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, and in them she saw not pity, but a quiet, pragmatic expectation. He gestured with his chin toward the creek. The command was clear. "This, you can do." Laura took the skin, her trembling hands closing around the cool, supple leather. The weight was manageable. As she limped toward the creek, the sting of humiliation began to recede, replaced by a bewildering new sensation. Her father had looked at her sturdy frame and seen only a flaw, a gluttonous failure. This warrior, this chief of a people so alien to her, had looked at the same body and seen not weakness, but a capacity for work that simply needed to be properly assigned. The shame was still there, a heavy cloak upon her soul, but for the first time, she felt the first thread of it begin to unravel. The heart of the camp was a great circle of men seated around a crackling fire, their faces painted in the flickering orange light. Laura, mending a torn hide with an awkward bone needle, watched from the periphery, a ghost at the edge of a world she could observe but never truly enter. The air, cool with the coming of night, smelled of pine smoke and roasted meat. But here, in this circle, the atmosphere was thick with tension. She could not understand the rapid guttural flow of the Lakota tongue, but she could read the language of the body. She saw the vehement gestures of a warrior with a long scar down his cheek, his voice rising in passionate appeal. She saw the weary nods of older men, their faces etched with the memory of too many battles. Then she saw Crazy Horse. He sat straight-backed, his face a mask of stone, but his stillness was a lie. Within his mind, a storm raged. The warrior, standing elk, spoke of peace, of accepting the white man's offer of rations on the reservation. Rations, Crazy Horse thought, the word a poison in his mind. Chains, beggars' food to keep us fat and docile while they carve up the paha sapa, the heart of everything. He saw the railroad ties like scars across the plains, heard the death scream of the buffalo, felt the crushing weight of a future where his people were penned like cattle. His vision was so clear, so absolute, it was a torment. He looked at the faces around the fire and saw not allies but divisions. He saw fear where there should be fury, exhaustion where there should be resolve. The rage that simmered within him was not the calm certainty of a wise chief. It was the desperate, lonely fury of a prophet whose warnings fell on deaf ears. Later, as the moon climbed high and the camp settled into a low murmur, he found her by the creek, her task of filling the small water skin complete. She sat on a smooth stone, her head bowed, the picture of weary solitude. He did not speak, but his presence was a tangible thing. She looked up, startled, expecting an order. Instead, he simply stood there, his gaze falling upon her hands, which were now calloused and cracked from her work. A memory, sharp and cruel, surfaced in her mind. Jebediah laughing, calling her hands pudgy pillows, good for nothing but lifting a fork. The words escaped her before she could stop them, a painful whisper in the quiet night. My brother. He said my hands were useless. She braced herself for the silence of contempt or, worse, agreement. Crazy Horse's dark eyes lifted from her hands to her face. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone of deep ingrained shame. His mind, ever practical, made a simple observation. He had seen these hands learn to grind corn, to scrape a hide, to carry water. He had seen her sturdy frame, which her own people had clearly mocked, endure a crippling injury and the subsequent hardships without complaint. To him, her size was not a sign of gluttony, but of resilience. A willow snapped in the wind, a mighty oak endured. She was an oak. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not pity. It was an acknowledgement of a fact. He had heard her. He had seen her work. Her shame was a thing of her world, not his. In his, her hands were not useless. They were learning. And in that simple, silent validation, Laura felt a foundation shift deep within her. The weight of her father's world, with all its cruel measurements and verdicts, suddenly seemed a little less real, a little less absolute. The change began, not in her mind, but in her flesh. The soft, pillowy fat that her brothers had so mercilessly mocked seemed to melt away, not disappearing, but compacting, hardening into a foundation of solid strength. The endless days of hauling water, grinding corn, and now, the grueling task of scraping buffalo hides, had chiseled away at the woman she had been. Her hands, once smooth and useless, were now a cartographer's map of her new life, traced with calluses, cracks, and the faint, pale lines of new scars. The work was brutal, an agony that settled deep in her shoulders and back, yet with it came a strange, invigorating clarity. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of her stone tool against the stiff hide was a litany, a prayer of purpose that drowned out the ghosts of her father's curses. The Lakota women, who had once eyed her with a mixture of suspicion and disdain, now worked alongside her. Their silence was no longer a judgment but a shared language of labor. An older woman named Sunbird, whose face was a beautiful tapestry of wrinkles, once paused, watching Laura struggle to maintain the correct angle with her scraper. Without a word, she reached over, adjusted Laura's grip, and gave a single firm nod when the tool bit into the hide more effectively. There was no praise, no condescension. It was the simple, practical gesture of one craftswoman to another. That small correction, that acknowledgement of her as a contributor rather than a burden, was more precious to Laura than any jewel. She was no longer a guest or a prisoner. She was part of the thrumming, relentless work that sustained the camp. Crazy Horse observed this transformation from the periphery, his mind a whirlwind of greater, more desperate concerns. He had just returned from a tense council with the Cheyenne, their talk full of compromise and weariness. They did not feel the urgency he did. They did not see the iron snake of the railroad devouring their world one sleeper tie at a time. His spirit was raw with frustration, and his leadership felt like a heavy cloak woven from the doubts of others. Then his eyes would fall upon Laura. He saw the sweat beading on her brow, the grim set of her jaw as she forced a hide into submission. He saw a resilience he wished he could instill in every one of his warriors. She, who had come from the enemy's world, broken and discarded, was somehow reforging herself in the heart of his own. The irony was not lost on him. It was a small, quiet puzzle in the midst of a roaring war. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, he found her soaking her aching hands in a bowl of cool water near the edge of the camp. He stood before her, a tall silhouette against the fading light. She tensed, expecting a new task. Instead, he knelt, his movements economical and precise. He touched the rim of the wooden bowl. "Mani," he said, his voice a low rumble. He tapped his own chest. "Tashunke Witko." He then pointed a finger toward her. Laura stared, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was giving her words. Keys. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Laura," she whispered. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Then he pointed to the fire burning in the distance. "Feta." He swept his hand toward the vast, darkening canopy above them. "Mapia." She repeated them, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar shapes of the sounds. "Mnipeta." "Makpia." He corrected her pronunciation with a quiet patience that felt utterly alien. It was not kindness, as she had ever known it, not a soft and pitying thing. It was a practical, profound act of inclusion. As she whispered the word for sky back to him, looking from his unreadable face to the first stars pricking the darkness, she felt the last of her father's chains turn to dust and blow away on the prairie wind. The news arrived on the back of a lathered horse, carried by a young scout whose eyes were wide with a new and specific kind of fear. He slid from his pony before it had fully stopped, his words tumbling out in a torrent of Lakota that sliced through the mundane afternoon calm of the camp. Laura, sitting with Sunbird and mending a hide cloak, could not follow the meaning, but she understood the effect. The steady rhythm of work faltered and ceased. Women rose from their tasks, their faces turning toward the council fire where the men were already gathering. The air, which moments before had smelled of wood smoke and drying meat, now seemed to crackle with a sharp metallic tension. At the center of the hastily formed circle of warriors sat Crazy Horse, his face an unreadable mask, but within his mind a familiar firestorm of fury was gathering force. The scout spoke of a new group of white men, not soldiers or lone prospectors, but engineers, men with strange measuring tools and wagons filled with black powder. They were not merely passing through, they were scarring the earth, driving stakes into the sacred soil of the Pahasapa, blasting through hillsides with a methodical, unnatural violence. His lieutenants offered counsel. Some urged caution, others spoke of treaties. Standing Elk, his face a grimace of weary pragmatism, suggested they were too few to fight this new encroachment directly. Crazy Horse's patience, already worn thin by the equivocations of other tribes, snapped. The fury within him was not just anger, but the profound, isolating rage of a man who sees the world ending, while others around him debate the color of the sky. He saw their caution as cowardice, their pragmatism as a prelude to surrender. He dismissed Standing Elk's concerns with a sharp gesture, his voice a low, dangerous growl that cut the other warrior to the quick. In his mind he was surrounded by men who could not see the iron snake for the individual rails. From the edge of the circle, Laura listened, her own work forgotten. She saw the warriors gesturing toward the hills, their hands mimicking the act of digging, their expressions a mixture of anger and confusion. She heard the words for black powder and stone, and a sudden, shocking realization dawned. They did not understand what they were seeing. They saw random destruction. She, a child of the mines, saw a pattern. She saw tunnels being surveyed, support structures being planned. Hesitation warred with a desperate new need to be of use. The voice of her father, calling her a useless sow, echoed in her memory, a cold hand trying to pull her back into silence. But another, stronger impulse won out. She stood, her heart hammering, and walked toward the circle of men. A murmur went through them as they parted for her, their eyes filled with surprise. She knelt in the dust before Crazy Horse and, taking a charred stick from the fire's edge, she began to draw. She drew the shape of a tunnel, the cross-hatching of support beams, the placement of charges to blast rock with maximum efficiency. Her Lakota was clumsy, a handful of nouns he had taught her, but her drawings were the language of her former life, precise and clear. "Feta," she said, pointing to where the powder would go. "For the iron road." Crazy Horse watched, his initial impatience giving way to a sharp, focused intensity. He, who could read the shifting of a herd from miles away, was now seeing a map of his enemy's mind, drawn in the dirt by this discarded woman. This was not random violence. It was a plan, more insidious and permanent than any cavalry charge. Her knowledge was a weapon. His gaze lifted from the drawing to her face, and for the first time, he saw not a survivor or a worker, but a strategist. He gave a sharp, decisive nod, a silent acknowledgement that changed everything. The scorned woman, the gluttonous failure, had just given him the key to understanding his foe, and in the sudden, sharp intake of her breath, she felt not just useful, but powerful. A silence, deeper and more unsettling than the quiet of night, had fallen over the camp. It was the silence of hunger. The scent of roasted venison no longer clung to the breeze, replaced by the thin, dusty smell of stretched rations and the gnawing anxiety that emanated from the teepees like a cold fog. The children's laughter was muted, their games listless. The women's conversations, once a constant flowing river of sound, had become short, hushed exchanges, their eyes holding a familiar, weary fear. Laura felt the old panic, the ghost of her father's judgment, stir within her. She was a mouth to feed, a large frame that required sustenance. The shame was a physical thing, a cold knot in her belly that mimicked the very hunger she dreaded representing. She watched as the women worked, their efforts born of desperation rather than design. A small group would set out to forage for roots, only to cross paths with another group returning from the same sparse patch of woods with near-empty baskets. The last of the dried meat was being portioned with a painful slowness, a task that fell to a grieving sunbird, whose hands trembled as she counted out the meager strips. It was chaos born of fear, an inefficiency that grated against every instinct Laura had. Within Crazy Horse's mind, this small crisis was a mirror to the greater war. He saw the dwindling stores not as a temporary hardship, but as a symptom of the slow strangulation of his people. The iron roads had chased the buffalo herds south, the miners had poisoned the streams, and now the Paja Sapa itself was being dissected by men with black powder. Standing Elk and the other council members saw only the empty larder. He saw the future, a reservation where his people would be fed from the white man's hand like tamed pets. The rage and despair of it was a constant fire in his soul, isolating him in a way no battle ever could. He watched Laura from the door of his teepee. He saw the conflict on her face, the way her strong hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. Then he saw her move. She walked with a purpose that cut through the camp's lethargy, approaching Sunbird. Using the few Lakota words she possessed and a flurry of clear, decisive gestures, she laid out a plan in the dust. She drew the camp, then drew lines radiating outward, to the creek for fishing, to the northern woods for trapping small game, to the southern hills for the last of the berries. She separated the strongest women for the hardest tasks, her own sturdy body implicitly part of that group. She pointed to herself, then to the heavy grinding stones, then to the sacks of remaining corn, making a gesture of careful, precise measurement. She was not asking for permission. She was imposing order. Sunbird looked from the drawings in the dust to Laura's determined face, and after a long moment, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. A current of new energy moved through the women. The scattered efforts coalesced into a focused, humming machine of survival, with Laura at its center, her physical strength no longer a mark of shame but a pillar of reliability. That night, as a thin stew bubbled over a communal fire, a testament to the day's organized success, Crazy Horse found her sitting apart, her shoulders slumped with the profound exhaustion of true purpose. He sat near her, the space between them charged with a new and potent quiet. He did not speak of her accomplishment. Instead, he looked out toward the distant dark shape of the hills. Washichu, he murmured, the word for the white man. He then touched his own chest and spoke a name, soft as a prayer, a name Laura had never heard. Wingyan, woman. He then swept a hand out, as if clearing a space before him, and whispered, Chingcha, child. His gaze was distant, lost in a memory that was a raw and living wound. He made a shape in the air, the unmistakable outline of a small cabin, like the one she had been left to die in. Then his hand became a fist, and he brought it down, mimicking the blast of black powder, the shattering of a life. He looked at her then, and in his eyes, she saw the depths of his private war. He was not an idealized chief or a stoic warrior. He was a man who had lost everything to the world she came from. In sharing this sliver of his soul, he was not accusing her, he was acknowledging her. He was seeing her, not as a white woman, but as a fellow survivor, another soul reforged in the fires of loss. A single tear traced a path through the grime on Laura's cheek, a silent answer to his unspoken story, and in the space between them, something fragile and incredibly powerful began to bloom. The world became larger on horseback. Laura rode beside him now, on her own sturdy pony, no longer a helpless burden pressed against his back. The land unrolled before them, a vast tapestry of sagebrush and sun-bleached grass under a sky so immense it felt like a holy presence. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with the rhythmic drumming of hooves, the sigh of the wind through the plains, and the creak of worn leather. It was in these silences that he would speak, his voice a low counterpoint to the wind, not directed at her so much as released into the open air, as if the land itself were his only true confidant. He spoke of the iron road that bled across the earth, of treaties that were nothing more than lies written on paper. His fury, which burned so hot and isolating in the council circle, here became a kind of profound sorrow. From an omniscient perch, one could see the landscape through his eyes. Every hill held a memory of a victory, every stream a story of his ancestors. He did not see terrain to be conquered or owned. He saw a living, breathing body, and the Washichu were flaying it alive. His burden was not merely to lead his people, but to be the memory of a world that was dying. One day, as the setting sun bled across the horizon, she found the courage to offer a confession of her own. "The firewater," she began, her voice barely a whisper, her gaze fixed on her own calloused hands gripping the reins. "The whiskey, it was to make the world quiet, to stop the voices." She felt the old shame rise, hot and acidic, expecting his contempt, his dismissal. This was the deepest stain on her soul, the proof of her father's verdict that she was a thing of appetite and nothing more. Crazy Horse turned his head, his dark eyes resting on her profile. He did not see a drunkard. He saw a captive who had been forced to drink her own poison. Her world, The world of fences and greed and words that cut like knives had driven her to it. It was another of the white man's diseases, a sickness of the spirit. He recognized the symptoms, for he was fighting the disease itself. He gave a slight, acknowledging nod. The voices of ghosts, he said, his own Lakota words, rough but clear. They are loud. He was not judging her weakness. He was acknowledging her wound. That quiet acceptance was the final key. Later that week, kneeling by the creek to fill a water skin, she saw her own reflection. For a lifetime, mirrors and shop windows had shown her a monster of her father's creation, a glutton, a failure, a mass of unwanted flesh. But the woman staring back from the rippling surface of the water was different. Her face was leaner, browned by the sun. Her arms, bare to the elbow, were not soft pillows of fat, but were corded with muscle from hauling hides and grinding corn. Her entire frame, the source of so much shame, now radiated a power that was palpable. This body was not a prison, it was a fortress. It had endured abandonment, injury, starvation, and grueling labor. It had survived. A slow smile spread across her face, a genuine, unburdened thing. She was not the willow her father had wished for, fragile and easily shaped. She was the oak as he had seen, and she was beautiful. Looking up from her reflection, her gaze swept across the familiar chaos of the camp. She saw Sunbird teaching a young girl to beat a moccasin, saw the children chasing a dog near the fire, heard the low murmur of the women she worked beside every day. These were not her captors. They were her family. She had not been traded or won or claimed. She had been found, and in finding her place among them, she had finally, truly, found herself. The quiet hum of the afternoon was a fragile thing, a melody woven from the rhythmic scrape of Sunbird's fleshing tool, the soft thud of a pestle on corn, and the distant, happy shrieks of children playing by the creek. Laura knelt beside the older woman, her hands, now strong and competent, stitching a tear in a winter moccasin. The sun warmed the back of her neck, a gentle, benevolent touch. This peace, once an alien concept, had become the very air she breathed. It was shattered by the frantic barking of a dog, followed by the appearance of 3 figures on horseback, cresting the low ridge to the east. They were not Lakota. They were gaunt, ragged apparitions from a world she had buried. Her father, Elias, sat slumped on a half-starved nag, his face a mask of bitter resentment carved into sunburnt leather. Jebediah and Silas flanked him, their familiar sneers looking predatory and desperate on their thinner faces. They reeked of failure, of dust and sour sweat. As they rode into the clearing, the work of the camp ceased. A silence fell, sharp and sudden. Warriors materialized from the shadows of teepees, their faces impassive, their hands resting near the weapons at their waists. "There she is," Jebediah rasped, pointing a grubby finger. "Look at her, gone full savage." Elias slid from his horse, his boots sinking into the dust of the camp. His eyes, small and hard as pebbles, found Laura. "Get your things," he commanded, his voice devoid of greeting, filled only with the grating authority of ownership. "We're leaving." The words struck Laura like a physical blow. The old terror, cold and sickening, coiled in her stomach. Her father's gaze was a physical weight, pressing her down, reminding her of the splintered beam, the darkness, the absolute certainty of her worthlessness. A stone tied round this family's neck. The voice was no longer a memory. It was here, real and venomous. "She's our property," Silas added, his voice loud and aimed at the silent warriors gathering around them. "That there is our sister. You horse-thieving savages stole her." Laura felt her breath catch, her world shrinking to the space between her father's furious glare and the silent, watching circle of Lakota. But as she looked at her hands, clenched into fists in her lap, she saw not the soft, useless pillows of Jebediah's mockery, but calloused, scarred tools that knew the weight of work and purpose. She felt the solid strength in her legs, the power in her shoulders. She was not the same woman they had left to die. From the door of his tepee, Crazy Horse observed the scene, his mind a cold, calculating engine. He did not understand the harsh, guttural sounds of the white men's language, but he understood the language of invasion. He saw the proprietary glare in the older man's eyes, the arrogant posture of the younger ones. He saw the way Laura flinched, the ghost of an old obedience fighting with the new strength in her spine. This was a complication he could not afford. These men were flies, insignificant but capable of spreading disease, of drawing the attention of the blue-coated soldiers. His council was already divided, his authority questioned by men who preached caution. To provoke a fight over this woman could be seen as reckless, a confirmation of Standing Elk's accusations. Yet, to hand her over, to let these men drag her away like a possession, was to concede that the sanctuary of his camp was meaningless, that his protection was a lie. His gaze fell on Laura, on the defiant set of her jaw. She was not a possession. She was a survivor. She was an oak. His decision when it came was not about her. It was about the integrity of his world. The dust settled into a suffocating silence, each particle a witness to her father's decree. Laura's heart, which had learned a new and steady rhythm in this place, now hammered against her ribs with the wild, frantic beat of a trapped bird. Elias Maverick's gaze was a physical chain, pulling her back into a past she had only just begun to escape. He saw her hesitation, the flicker of old fear in her eyes, and like a prospector seeing a glint of gold, he pressed his advantage. "Laura, listen to me," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of feigned reason that was more venomous than his anger. "It's your family. Blood. We've had a hard run of it, but we're still blood. A daughter's place is with her father." He took a step closer, his hand outstretched, not in comfort, but in claim. In his mind, she was no longer a worthless stone, but a newly valuable asset. Her sturdy frame, which he had once cursed as gluttonous, now looked strong, capable. She can work. The thought coiled in his greedy heart. We need her strength. The plea, hollow as it was, landed on Laura's soul like a spark on dry tinder. The guilt, the shame, the crushing weight of a lifetime of duty, it all came rushing back. For a dizzying moment, she was once again that girl on her knees, the taste of whiskey and worthlessness on her tongue. Just as the old world threatened to swallow her whole, a presence altered the space beside her. It was Crazy Horse. He did not step in front of her to shield her, nor did he lay a hand on her arm to restrain her. He simply stood near, a silent mountain offering its shadow. He turned his gaze from Laura's family to his own watchful warriors, some of whose faces were tight with disagreement, reflecting the divisions he fought every day. He spoke, not to her father, but into the tense air between them. His Lakota words, a low rumble, meant for her ears alone. "A single branch is easily snapped," he said, his eyes meeting Standing Elk's for a fraction of a second. "But many branches, bound together, they are strong. A family, a tribe. It must choose to be bound. It cannot be commanded." He was not giving her an order. He was sharing the weight of his own burden, the constant struggle to forge unity from dissent. He was treating her not as a child to be directed, but as a leader facing her own counsel. His words were a gift of cool, clear water on her fevered spirit. She looked at her father's grasping hand, then at her own, calloused and capable. She saw Sunbird watching her, her expression unreadable but steady. She felt the solid earth beneath her feet, this ground she had worked and bled on, this place that had demanded everything from her and in return had given her a self. Laura rose slowly, every movement deliberate, unfolding to her full height. She was no longer the cowering girl who flinched from shadows. She met her father's eyes, and for the first time, saw not a terrifying god, but a small, desperate man. "No," she said. The word was quiet, yet it carried the weight of the mountains behind her. "My place is here." She swept a hand to encompass the silent tippies, the watchful women, the scent of wood smoke on the wind. "This is my family now. These are my people. This is my home." The word hung in the air, a declaration of war more final than any gunshot. Laura's no was a fortress wall thrown up against her past, and her father's face, a moment before a mask of grasping authority, crumpled into disbelief, then twisted into pure rage. Jebediah lunged forward, his hand reaching not for her, but for the rifle on his saddle, his face a snarl of outraged ownership. But it was one of the other prospectors, a man with fear-wild eyes and trembling hands, who shattered the peace. The crack of his rifle was a sharp, ugly sound that ripped the quiet afternoon to shreds. Instantly, the world exploded. The air became a living thing, thick with the acrid sting of gunpowder, the whine of lead, and the terrifying, ululating war cries of the Lakota warriors as they moved with a fluid, deadly grace. Elias and his sons, who had postured with such bravado moments before, dove for the scant cover of a supply wagon, their bodies a testament to craven self-preservation. From an omniscient view, their minds were simple circuits of panic, a stark, pathetic contrast to the complex tactical map igniting in the mind of Crazy Horse. Laura did not cower. A primal fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her, but it was overwhelmed by a fierce protective instinct. She saw the women pulling their children toward the safety of the deeper camp, and her eyes, trained by her recent work, saw a vulnerability, a gap in the natural defenses where a few warriors were struggling to roll a heavy, fallen pine log into place for a barricade. Without a conscious thought, she ran, her powerful legs pumping, her body feeling not heavy, but anchored, a vessel of purpose. She put her shoulder to the rough, sticky bark of the log, adding her considerable strength to the warrior's efforts. Muscles she had honed hauling water and scraping hides, bunched and strained. For a moment it resisted, and then, with a collective grunting heave, the log rolled into place, creating a solid wall of protection. A bullet thudded into the wood just inches from her face, sending splinters flying, but she barely flinched. She felt a fierce, exhilarating joy. This body, her lifelong burden, was now a shield. Across the chaotic clearing, Crazy Horse saw it all. His mind was a storm of calculations, tracking the enemy's positions, dispatching warriors to flank them from the trees, his commands low and sharp. Yet in that maelstrom, he registered her action, not merely as help, but as a tactical contribution. She had seen a weakness and, with raw instinct, moved to fortify it. This was the vision he fought to instill in his men, a quality Standing Elk, for all his bravery, lacked. This woman, discarded by her own people, understood the essence of a unified defense better than some who had been born to it. The skirmish was over almost as quickly as it began. Caught in a crossfire, the prospectors broke and fled, leaving behind two of their own motionless in the dust. As the last echoes of gunfire faded, a profound silence descended, thick with the metallic smell of blood and spent powder. Laura stood panting, her hands braced on the log she had helped move, her entire being thrumming with adrenaline and a sense of profound, unshakable rightness. Crazy Horse walked toward her, his movements economical, his eyes sweeping over the scene. He stopped before her, his face streaked with grime, his gaze intense. He did not offer praise or comfort. Instead, he simply lifted a hand and gently, with the pad of his thumb, wiped a smudge of gunpowder from her cheek. The gesture was fleeting, a small act in the midst of carnage, yet it was more intimate than any kiss. It was an acknowledgement, a signing of a new treaty written in fire and courage. In his touch, she felt not the claim of ownership she had fled, but the silent, absolute recognition of a fellow warrior. Her worth was no longer a question to be debated. It was a fact, proven on the battlefield and sealed by the leader who had seen its truth all along. The peace of the morning was a tangible thing, a quiet rhythm set by the scrape of Laura's stone on hide and the low, contented murmur of Sunbird beside her. The sun fell upon her shoulders like a benediction. Then the rhythm broke, the distant pounding of hooves, too numerous and too uniform to be a hunting party, rose from the plains. Every woman in the camp fell still, their hands frozen over their work. A wave of silence washed over the village as warriors emerged from their teepees, their faces hardening into masks of grim vigilance. They were not alone this time. Her father, Elias, rode at the fore, but flanking him were the stark, disciplined forms of a dozen blue-coated cavalrymen, their carbines held at the ready, the brass buttons on their uniforms glinting like cruel, cold eyes under the prairie sun. The jingle of their harnesses was an alien sound, a metallic desecration of the natural quiet. At their head rode a young officer, his face set in a look of weary duty. They halted at the edge of the clearing, a formal line of intrusion. Elias swung down from his horse, his face a canvas of righteous fury. "Laura!" he bellowed, the sound tearing through the fragile peace. "I've come to take you home, to save you from this filth." The officer dismounted, his movements stiff. "Ma'am," he began, his voice devoid of emotion, "your father has filed a formal complaint. He claims you are being held against your will. Our orders are to escort you back to Virginia City. You have a choice, of course. Come with us peacefully, or we will be forced to retrieve you." The choice was a lie, a gilded cage offered with a sword. Laura's heart seized, the old, familiar terror rising like bile in her throat. She could feel the weight of her father's gaze, the crushing judgment of the entire world he represented. In his eyes, she was still a disgrace, a possession to be reclaimed. His mind was a simple, brutal ledger. He had been humiliated, and reclaiming his wayward daughter was a matter of restoring his honor and acquiring a strong back for labor. Just then a shadow fell beside her. Crazy Horse had moved to stand near her, his presence a silent declaration. He did not look at her, but at the soldiers, his mind a whirlwind of cold, strategic fire. He saw not a dozen men, but the vanguard of an army. He saw the friction this could cause with standing elk, the potential for a massacre over a single woman. But he also saw Laura, her spine straightening, the tremor in her hands ceasing. He had seen her build herself from the ashes of her old life. To let her be taken now would be to deny the very resilience he had come to respect. He would honor her choice, whatever the cost. He had already decided. Laura drew a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and sagebrush and freedom. She looked past the rigid blue uniforms, past her father's apoplectic face, and saw Sunbird, who nodded once, a slow, deep affirmation. She saw the faces of the women she worked beside, the warriors who now saw her not as an outsider, but as one of their own. She finally turned her gaze upon her father. The terror was gone, burned away by the clean fire of her new self. "I am not your property," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent clearing. "I am not a stone to be carried or a mouth to be cursed. You did not come to save me. You came to claim me." She took a step forward, planting her feet firmly on the earth she now knew as home. "I made my choice the day you left me to die. I choose them." Her hand swept out, not in a gesture of grandeur, but of simple, profound belonging. "This is my family. This is my home. I am not going back." The dust of her father's departure had long since settled, blown away by the prairie wind, but the change it had wrought remained, etched into the very fabric of the camp. Laura, a name that now felt like a borrowed dress, ill-fitting and foreign, moved through her days with a quiet, earned purpose. The strength in her arms as she lifted a full water skin, the callus on her palm from the grinding stone, the solid feel of the earth beneath her feet. These were no longer sources of shame, but verses in the poem of her new life. She worked beside Sunbird not as a student, but as a peer, their shared silence a comfortable language of mutual respect. Crazy Horse found her there as twilight began to bleed purple and rose across the vast sky. Her task done, her gaze lost in the deepening colors of the plains. In his mind, the chaos of the coming war was a constant storm, a tempest of fractured alliances and the relentless advance of the Iron Road. Yet when he saw her, a small, quiet space opened within that storm. She, who had been broken and discarded by the enemy, had become a symbol of the very resilience he fought to preserve in his people. Her quiet strength was a balm to his own furious, isolated spirit. He sat beside her, the scent of sage and horse on his leather tunic mingling with the wood smoke clinging to her hair. He did not speak of battles or councils. Instead, he took her hand, no longer the soft, useless thing he had first seen, but a map of her survival, and held it in his own. "A name is a path," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the first star that pricked the darkness. "The one you carried was a cage made by others." He looked at her then, his eyes holding the gravity of the land itself. "The people see you. Sunbird sees you. I see you. We give you a new path to walk." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "We will call you Mahuche Wingyan, woman of the land." The words entered her soul not as sound, but as truth. Laura, the failure, the burden, the drunkard, dissolved in that moment, turning to dust like the ghost she had been. In her place stood Mahuche Wingyan, a woman forged in fire and rooted in the earth that had claimed her. Tears streamed down her face, not of sorrow, but of a profound, shattering release. She was home. This was her name. This was her family. And as she looked from the unshakable warrior beside her to the endless, darkening land that was now their shared future, she knew that whatever came, she would stand. She was an oak, and she would not be moved.